Okay. Here we go. Here we go again, I should say. I forgot to press the record button. So I've been sitting here for the last few minutes talking to, well, I was talking to the cat, talking to Dixie. All right. And myself, of course. So this is session number 68. We're in chapter 9, the acceptance of the atonement, very fundamental principle in Course in Miracles. And this is section 4, the Holy Spirit's plan of forgiveness. All right? This is the way the Holy Spirit perceives forgiveness. All right? So let's just begin. I'll make sure this video is moving. Yes, it is. Okay. Atonement is for all, because it is the way to undo the belief that anything is for you alone. To forgive is to overlook. Look then beyond error, and do not let your perception rest upon it, for you will believe what your perception holds. Accept as true only what your brother is, if you would know yourself. Perceive what he is not, and you cannot know what you are, because you see him falsely. Remember always that your identity is shared, and that its sharing is its reality. All right, there's so much packed into this paragraph. All right, atonement is for all because it's the way to undo the belief that anything is for you alone. So the atonement is the way to undo the belief that there are separate entities here, that there is separation. Atonement is the way to undo the belief in separation of all kinds. There is only the oneness. We're working our way to remembering that. Remember, our task is to remove the blocks to the awareness of the oneness. Right? And of course, there's the awareness of love's presence, right? In which you would become aware of the oneness. Right? Remember, we're using words to try to learn and teach and understand something that's beyond words, something that can only really be experienced. All right? The intellect is cool up to a certain point, but these things have to be experienced. All right? There was a Taoist master who's still active on YouTube, teaching his Taoist esoteric yoga, as he would call it. And he would say everything is theory until practice. All right? And that's the way it is. You know, the intellect can grasp, so many great things, but it's all theory until you put it into practice, until you apply it to your daily life, your everyday situations. Okay? Okay then. So then he says to forgive is to overlook. And we're not talking about, oh well, we just won't pay attention to that. Right? He's not saying that. He's saying look beyond the error. And do not let your perception rest on it, because you'll believe what your perception holds. Right? And then he clarifies it. He says, accept as true only what your brother is. Right? If you would know yourself. Now, in that sentence is, it's the idea of looking past the error, accepting who and what your brother really is, right? But besides that, he's telling you that this is the way to know who you are, because there's no separation. There's no me and you. There's no other. There's only the oneness. Okay? And Jesus keeps repeating these things over and over again in so many different beautiful ways that if you just, as Ken would always say, just let the words flow over you. All right? We don't need to dissect everything and like I'm doing, but just let the words flow over you. All right? And get in touch with that space, that mind space that produced these words. Okay? It's like we talk about being in the presence of a great work of art, all right, or in the symphony hall, or even sitting and listening to someone play a piece of music that is just so beautiful that you're lifted. All right, you're in that space. Right, you're in that space that produced that beauty, that truth. All right, you're in the proverbial mindset of the artist, right, which is only channeling channeling the truth and letting it come out into a language that we can understand, a form that we can understand, all right, a form that we can touch with the senses, and yet it brings us above. All right, it brings us above form. All right, so our brother is like that. We see who he truly is, looking beyond the error. Okay? So he says, perceive what he is not, and you cannot know what you are, because you see him falsely. So if I see the other as guilty of something, right, then I don't get to know myself, right? Because that has to come from projection, right? He says, remember always that your identity is shared. And the identity is spelled with a capital I, so it's who you truly are. Remember that who you truly are is shared. It's the oneness. There are no separate entities. And that it's sharing is its reality. It's what you do in reality, is you extend. Okay. Remember that. We'll say that over and over again, I'm sure. All right. So, in paragraph 2, he says, you have a part to play in the atonement. All right? But the plan of the atonement is beyond you. You do not understand how to overlook errors, or you would not make them. It would merely be further error to believe either that you do not make them or that you can correct them without a guide to correction. And if you do not follow this guide, your errors will not be corrected. The plan is not yours because of your limited ideas about what you are. This sense of limitation is where all errors arise. The way to undo them, therefore, is not of you, but it's for you. Okay? This is another jam-packed paragraph here. He says, you have a part to play in the atonement, which is accepting who you really are. Okay? But the plan is beyond you. He says, you didn't make up the plan. Okay? You do not understand how to overlook errors. You don't know how to do that. Why? Because we believe we're in the state of separation from oneness, where aligned with the ego thought system. So in that condition, it's impossible to overlook errors, because the ego will always make the error real, right? And we'll get to that. The error is always some form of guilt in form, okay? So the ego likes to make that real, because if it's real, you exist as an entity. All right. So you have a part to play. You don't understand how to overlook errors, or you would not make them. It would merely be further error to believe either that you don't make errors, right, or that you can correct them without a guide, without the guide to correction. All right? And if you do not follow this guide, your errors will not be corrected. All right? So he's telling us you don't do this by yourself, because you believe you're in the ego, and you're just going to be making ego corrections. All right? And the ego is always wrong. Okay? The ego is always coming from the idea of we're separate from our source, and it wants to keep things that way. So, and it's very subtle, the ego too. It's like, you know, you'll see how he talks about it, and I believe it's the next section. All right, there's many different ways that we go around trying to heal people, all right, emotionally, spiritually, physically. All right, but he says, the plan is not yours because of your limited ideas about what you are. All right, and this sense of limitation, which is the ego thought system, right? I just turned my back on everything. Right now I'm less than everything. I'm lacking something. This sense of limitation, he says, it's where all your errors arise. So once again, in a different way, he's telling us that the one problem is the belief you separated from God. All right, now you have this sense of lack. Oh my God, I used to have everything. Okay, he says all your errors arise from that. All right, and the way to undo them, therefore, is not of you, all right, but it's for you. So the memory that we have with us, the memory of who we are, is what we need to contact in order to have errors corrected. Help me to see this situation correctly. Help me to see this brother correctly. All right? There's an exercise, right, in the workbook for students, the workbook, which is the 365 exercises. It's exercise number 28, only because I know that because it's early in the year. And 27 says, above all else, I want to see. And 28 says, above all else, I want to see correctly. All right. And he says, you don't have to understand it, just practice looking at things and realize that you don't understand what you're looking at. All right. He's trying to break the hold on the ego thought system. All right, but that's something we can practice all our lives, is help me to see correctly. Because he says one sincere repetition of that sentence, that statement, he says, will save you years of practice. I just want to see correctly. All right? Because it's a plea that I don't want to see through my ego's eyes. I don't want to see the other. I don't want to see my brother through my ego's eyes. I'm tired of that. All right? The ego's just going to show me what's wrong with them. Okay. So he says you have to follow the guide. If you do not follow the guide, your errors will not be corrected. So if we don't ask for help, your errors will not be corrected. You'll just go along. You might think they're corrected, all right? But they're not. And you'll find out sooner or later. Paragraph 3. The atonement is a lesson in sharing, which is given you because you have forgotten how to do it. All right. The Holy Spirit merely reminds you of the natural use of your abilities. By reinterpreting the ability to attack into the ability to share, he translates what you have made into what God created. If you would accomplish this through him, you cannot look on your abilities through the eyes of the ego, or you will judge them as it does. All their harmfulness lies in the ego's judgment. All their helpfulness lies in the judgment of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So, the atonement, the idea that you never left, right? The idea that you are as innocent as the moment you were thought of. Right? You have never sinned. You have never separated from God. He says that's a lesson in sharing. We want to share that idea. We want to extend. That's what we do. All right? He says, but you've forgotten how to do it. All right? So the Holy Spirit merely reminds you of your natural abilities. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Well, that's what you are doing. All right? As Jesus says, your other life continues. All right? Well, we're dreaming of this exile here. So the Holy Spirit merely reminds you of the natural use of your abilities. All right? And he does that by reinterpreting the ability to attack. All right? And that means to find fault and attack in all different ways. Mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally. Right? Even if you're not acting or you're not verbalizing, you're just thinking. What a punk. Whatever. What a jerk. All right? So that's the ability to attack. And the Holy Spirit translates that ability into the ability to share. All right? To extend the idea that this other is just like me. He's the thought and the mind of God. He is me, as a matter of fact. Okay? I have to see past that sidewalk act that everybody's doing. All right? He translates what you have made into what God created over and over. Jesus tells us that. The Holy Spirit takes what we have made, all right, and translates it into what God created. That's why I'll come up with that famous line, we're going to use time, which we made, to escape time, to go back into the mind of God. So if you would accomplish this through him, you cannot look on your abilities through the eyes of the ego, right? So you don't judge yourself the way the ego would. Well, I'm just this human being here and doing the best I can and all those things, all right? He says, you don't look on your abilities through the eyes of the ego, or you will judge them as it does, right? You'll be limited, in other words. All the harmfulness of my abilities lies in the ego's judgment, right? And all the helpfulness lies in the judgment of the Holy Spirit, okay? So, paragraph 4. He says the ego too has a plan of forgiveness because you are asking for one, though not of the right teacher. The ego's plan, of course, makes no sense and will not work. By following its plan, you will merely place yourself in an impossible situation to which the ego always leads you. Right? No matter how slick the plan looks, right? The ego always leads you to an impossible situation. Right? The ego's plan, paragraph 4, sentence 4, the ego's plan is to have you see error clearly first, and then overlook it. Yet how can you overlook what you have made real? By seeing it clearly, you have made it real and cannot overlook it. This is where the ego is forced to appeal to mysteries, insisting that you must accept the meaningless to save yourself. Many have tried to do this in my name, forgetting that my words make perfect sense because they come from God. They are as sensible now as they ever were, because they speak of ideas that are eternal. Okay? And we'll get further into an explanation of these sentences when we look at the next section called the unhealed healer. All right? Because he says, many have tried to, forgive in my name. All right? He says, but, they're relying on, mysteries and things like that, You could just look back on any kind of religious training you received, from whatever religious line that you come from. All right, there's always mysterious explanations of things. I can explicitly remember as a little kid, people would ask questions in grammar school, and sometimes they would ask, like a little kid might say to the nun, well, if God is all good, how could he be angry? And so holding back the urge to slap the child, the nun might just say, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. And let me take back some of my smugness here. Not all nuns were like that, okay? I grew up in an age where corporal punishment was actually a part of the educational system. It was an accepted part of the educational system, all right? But not all nuns are like that, all right? As a matter of fact, in the same school where there were a couple of nutty nuns, there were some wonderful, just wonderful, holy and spiritual and kind women, okay? Let me get that, let me set the record straight, okay? I can name names if you want, all right? There were some very, very kind women working there as nuns, okay? They took their vocation seriously, okay, and their dedication to a spiritual life, all right? So I'm going to stop joking about that. So, we were in paragraph 4. So the ego's plan is to have you see error clearly first and then overlook it. All right? It's like, okay, I'll forgive you out of the kindness of my heart, But who knows? You might have to, repress the anger for years and years. Okay? And he says, many have tried to do this in my name, forgetting that my words make perfect sense because they come from God. Okay? And they are as sensible now as they ever were, because they speak of ideas that are eternal. And the ideas that his words speak of is the idea that there's only the oneness. All right? And we have never left the mind that thought of us. Okay? We have never left our source. All right? So, paragraph 5. Forgiveness that is learned of me does not use fear to undo fear, nor does it make real the unreal and then destroy it. Forgiveness through the Holy Spirit lies simply in looking beyond error from atonement from the beginning. All right? All right? Forgiveness through the Holy Spirit lies simply in looking beyond error from the beginning, and thus keeping it unreal for you. Do not let any belief in the realness enter your mind, or you will also believe that you must undo what you have made in order to be forgiven. What has no effect does not exist. And to the Holy Spirit, the effects of error are non-existent. By steadily and consistently canceling out all its effects everywhere and in all respects, he teaches that the ego does not exist and proves it. Okay? So, he says, forgiveness that is learned of me does not use fear to undo fear. Right? So, like, just for an example, there's no fear of reprisal. You know, there's no fear of purgatory or hell, right? Which is an amazingly fearful thought as a child. All right? The devil and hell and punishment, and it's like, oh my God. All right? But he says, forgiveness that is learned of me does not use fear to undo fear. Right? He says, because whatever you think you're doing wrong, it's basically because you're afraid. You are uncertain, lonely, and in constant fear. Because you believe you separated from God. You believe you separated from the oneness. Okay? So he says, if you learn forgiveness from me, it's not going to be about fear. All right? I got to stop talking so much. I'm getting dry. So a very powerful statement that he does here is that he says, what has no effect does not exist. All right, so what has no effect has no cause, okay? Has no impetus. All right, so what has no effect does not exist. And to the Holy Spirit, the effects of error are non-existent. All right, and why is that? Because you never separated from God. You never made the first mistake. You never made the error. So to the Holy Spirit, all right, the effects of error are non-existent. All right? But he'll tell us in so many poetic words, the Holy Spirit knows you're making stuff up. All right? And if you ask, he's going to help you to see things correctly. By steadily and consistently canceling out all its effects, everywhere and in all respects, he teaches that the ego does not exist and proves it. So, by canceling out all its effects, everywhere and in all respects, all right, and we kind of like live in slow motion, so we have to continually ask, help me to see correctly. Help me to cancel out my belief in this era, in that era, in this era. Until I get to the point where I realize, oh, I never left. The ego does not exist, all right? And it's a gentle process, okay? But the ego will have you be afraid of it. Don't go there. Don't even start on that road. So the Holy Spirit will teach that the ego does not exist. And he will prove it. Paragraph 6. Follow the Holy Spirit's teaching in forgiveness then, because forgiveness is his function, and he knows how to fulfill it perfectly. That is what I meant when I said that miracles are natural, and when they do not occur, something has gone wrong. Miracles are merely the sign of your willingness to follow the Holy Spirit's plan of salvation, recognizing that you do not understand what it is. His work is not your function, and unless you accept this, you cannot learn what your function is. Okay? So he knows how to fulfill his function perfectly. And his function is forgiveness. Okay? He says, and Jesus says, that's what I meant in the very beginning of the book, in the miracle principles, when he said that miracles are natural, and when they do not occur, something has gone wrong. So miracles, the correct perception, all right, or the corrected perception, all right, because you don't need miracles in reality, in heaven. So the corrected perception is, it's a natural thing. And if it's not happening, something has gone wrong. What could go wrong? All right, I go back to that belief that I'm separated from God. I'm seeing myself as very limited, and I'm seeing you as very limited too. All right? So we have to keep going and asking, help me to see correctly. All right? And then he says, and that miracles, that change in perception. Oh, this is what I think is going on, but I'd like to see correctly. I really want to. And then that's the miracle. The perception is changed, right? The form is not changed, but the interpretation of it has changed, all right? And he says miracles are a sign of they are merely, he used the word merely, miracles are merely the sign of your willingness to follow the Holy Spirit's plan of salvation, recognizing that you do not understand what it is. All right? So we don't have to understand it. We just have to want the correction. All right? As a matter of fact, at one point, Jesus says, your understanding makes no contribution to the truth. All right? So, take that. So miracles are merely the sign of your willingness to follow the Holy Spirit's plan of salvation, recognizing that you do not understand what it is. His work is not your function. And unless you accept this, you cannot learn what your function is. All right? That's another beautiful way of just saying, ask. Don't think you know already what the right thing to do is, or the way to forgive. Just continually be in contact with that holy instant, with the right mind, right? Where Jesus and the Holy Spirit represent who you are, the memory of who you are. You go there and you say, help me to see correctly. So I'm not taking over the function, all right? And I'm learning what my function is. I'm learning that my function is merely the extension of love, the extension of oneness, right? The extension of all that is, the inclusion of all that is. Okay. Paragraph 7. The confusion of functions is so typical of the ego that you should be quite familiar with it by now. The ego believes that all functions belong to it, even though it has no idea what they are. This is more than mere confusion. It is a particularly dangerous combination of grandiosity and confusion that makes the ego likely to attack anyone and anything for no reason at all. Right? This is exactly what the ego does. It is unpredictable in its responses because it has no idea of what it perceives. Right? It's got no idea what it is perceiving. Right? Like the early lesson says, I don't know what anything is for. Just clearing the mind of all this preconceived notions. And above all else, I want to see. And the exercise will have you take 2 minutes to look at things that are around you and say, I don't know what this coffee cup is for. Right? I don't know what that footstool is for. Right? I don't know what these instruments are for. Right? Just clearing the mind of preconceived notions. Right? Setting the way. Okay? And the ego, he says, the ego likes to think every function is its function. Right? Because it takes over. All right? Takes over from God. All right? What he thinks God's functions are. All right? Even if the ego, which it does, perceives God as punitive, the ego will take over that function too. He said, oh, don't worry about it, I got it. Right? I know I did something wrong, I'll punish myself. Okay? You don't have to take time out of your day to punish me, I'll do it myself. Okay? So the ego takes over every function. Okay? And the ego, because it's grandiose, it's totally self-centered. Okay? And he says it's a particularly dangerous combination of grandiosity and confusion. The ego doesn't even know what it is, but it touts this grandiosity, so it's a bad combination. All right? And it's liable to attack anyone and anything for no reason at all. All right? It is unpredictable in its responses because it has no idea of what it is perceiving. Paragraph 8. If you have no idea what is happening, how appropriately can you expect to react? You might task yourself, regardless of how you may account for the reaction, whether it's, pardon me, smudge on my glasses. Let me read that over again. Paragraph 8, sentence 2. You might ask yourself, regardless of how you may account for the reaction, whether its unpredictability places the ego in a sound position as your guide. Let me repeat that the ego's qualifications as a guide are singularly unfortunate, and that its remarkably poor choice as a teacher of salvation. Anyone who elects a totally insane guide must be totally insane himself. Nor is it true that you do not realize the guide is insane. You realize it because I realize it, and you have judged it by the same standard I have. So he's, you know, he's just telling it flat out. Look, the ego is insane. Ego doesn't know where it is, doesn't know what it is, right? It has no idea what's happening, right? It only works to continue to foster the idea of separation through the idea of guilt, all right, and fear of reprisal. And don't look at what I'm telling you, all right? Don't examine that, right? Just do what I'm saying, okay? It's remarkable how can we can apply these things to circumstances, let's just say, okay? All right. He says you have to ask yourself whether this, should you get a guide who's unpredictable like this? All right. He says if you have no idea what is happening, how appropriately can you expect to react? All right. I mean, think about it. Say, you know, you just wake up and you just came from a very deep sleep, perhaps with a vivid dream. Somebody wakes you up and you have no idea what's happening. So how appropriately can you expect to react? All right. I remember, guys, it's not a joke or anything. You know, if you woke them during the night, you know, their PTSD would kick in because they had no idea what was happening right now. Right? They could only relate to a sense of preservation. So, you know, it could be dangerous to shake them, wake them up. You'd have to do it from, you know, a distance, right? But it's just an example. If you have no idea what's happening, how can you expect to react appropriately? All right, how can you expect to react? How appropriately can you expect to react? All right, it's not appropriate to wake up swinging, throwing things, defending yourself. All right, in, you know, most social situations, that's not the way a person wakes up. But he doesn't know what's going on. So he reverts to instinct. And some of the recent situations he's been in, or she has been in. All right. So, you know, that's the ego guidance. All right. So, he says you might ask yourself, all right, is it a really good idea to have the ego as your guide? Okay. So, anyone who elects a totally insane guide must be totally insane himself. So anyone who chooses the ego, you got to be crazy, all right? And you know, we are, until we start to work our way out of it, all right? Nor is it true that you do not realize the guide is insane. So he says, don't give me that excuse, all right? He says, you realize it because I realize it, all right? You realize the guide is insane because I am in your mind, and sooner or later you're going to contact that idea that this guide is insane. So, paragraph 9. The ego literally lives on borrowed time, and its days are numbered. Okay? Do not fear the last judgment, but welcome it, and do not wait, for the ego's time is borrowed from your eternity. This is the second coming that was made for you, as the first was created. The second coming is merely the return of sense. Can this possibly be fearful? Okay. Some people teach that the second coming is filled with vengeance and wrath and whatnot. All right? And Jesus is telling you, it's just a return of sense. You're just going to be sensible. You're going to remember who you really are. He goes, is that fearful? All right? And he says the ego lives on borrowed time, and its days are numbered. Why does he say that? Because it depends on my choosing it. All right? And sooner or later, I will choose against it. And that's what the ego is afraid of. That's why the ego wants to keep me distracted. Don't go into your mind. Don't contact the memory of who you really are. Right? Stay focused on that pain in your foot. All right? Stay focused on, well, as you grow older, you see a lot of things to stay focused on as far as the body is concerned. But then there's things outside the body in the world. You could stay focused on them too. You know? The political scene is as hot as it's ever been. You could stay focused on that. All right? It's hotter than it was, well, you know, in the 60s it was pretty hot too, in the 70s. All right? But it's another way of keeping me out of my mind, out of my right mind. Going to where the memory of who I really am resides. Right? And in that contact with that memory is the resolution to all this nonsense. All right? All this mishigash, as my friends would say. All right? It's the resolution to all the craziness. All right? Where you would understand it. You would understand it completely, and you could see past it, right, to the truth in who people and situations really are. Right? But we need that guide. We need to contact the guide. Help me to see whatever it is. Help me to see it correctly. Whether it's a personal pain or something that's fearful outside. Okay? And so he says the ego lives on borrowed time. Because someday I'm going to completely say, no, I don't want this. I do not want the ego. All right? And we do that. We practice little by little. All right? When we realize that, I'm guided by the ego here. Right? I'm thinking terrible thoughts about this person. And it only leads to dead ends. No matter what solution I try, the anger, the guilt always resurfaces. Right? And they never get a peaceful conclusion that lasts very long. All right? So there must be a better way. So little by little I ask, help me to see this. All right? And we have these little movements, little advances, until we have the major advance. All right? And that major advance brings us to only want more. I want more peace. I want more true peace of mind. Okay? So he says the second coming is merely the return of sense. All right? Can this possibly be fearful? Paragraph 10. What can be fearful but fantasy? And who turns to fantasy unless he despairs of finding satisfaction in reality? Yet it is certain that you will never find satisfaction in fantasy, so that your only hope is to change your mind about reality. Only if the decision that reality is fearful is wrong, can God be right. And I assure you, God is right. Be glad then that you have been wrong. But this was only because you did not know who you were. Had you known, you could no more have been wrong than God can. All right? So he says, what can be fearful except fantasy? And let me tell you, he's very poetically telling you that the ego situations we find ourselves in are fantasy. All right? It's made up, fantastical world. Okay? And he says, and who turns to fantasy unless he despairs of finding satisfaction in reality? All right? He says, you'll never find satisfaction in fantasy. So your only hope is to change your mind about reality. All right? And then he goes on to explain that. He says, only if the decision that reality is fearful is wrong can God be right. So the ego thought system, like we say, tries to keep distracting you. Don't go there. It's fearful to go to your right mind. It's fearful. You're going to be destroyed. You're going to disappear. You're going to die. Right? You're going to be made to do stuff you don't want to do. Right? You're going to become a doormat. They always win. Whatever it is. But mostly is that you're going to disappear. You're going to be done away with. You're going to miss now. You're going to lose your family, your friends, everything. For those of you who have friends. You're going to lose everything. So reality becomes fearful. But Jesus says, only if that's wrong, all right, can God be right. And then he says, and I assure you, God is right. So in other words, that's wrong. The idea that reality is fearful is wrong. Okay? He says the reality is just the return of sense. Okay? And I assure you, all right, God is right. Be glad then that you have been wrong. Right? And he says, you've only been wrong because you forgot who you are. You don't know who you are. All right? You're one with God. You forgot. All right? And that's what the atonement is, once again, is the acceptance of that memory. Okay. It says, be glad then that you've been wrong. But this was only because you did not know who you were. Had you known, you could no more have been wrong than God can. So if you knew who you were, had you known, you couldn't be wrong. Right? You could be no more wrong than God could be. Right? Because you're just like him. The only difference is you didn't create God. Right? So, the impossible, paragraph 11, the impossible can happen only in fantasy. All right? The separation can happen only in fantasy. When you search for reality in fantasies, you will not find it. The symbols of fantasy are of the ego, and of these you'll find many. But do not look for meaning in them. They have no more meaning than the fantasies into which they are woven. Fairy tales can be pleasant or fearful, but no one calls them true. Children may believe them, and so, for a while, the tales are true for them. Yet when reality dawns, the fantasies are gone. Reality has not gone in the meanwhile. The second coming is the awareness of reality, not its return. Okay? Reality didn't go anywhere. It doesn't have to return. The reality of who you are is always there. Right? So the second coming is the awareness. All of a sudden the static, the fog clears, and it's like, oh, okay. everything's okay now. All right? So reality has not gone. All right? The second coming is the awareness of reality, not its return. And in a very gentle way, Jesus says in paragraph 12, "Behold, my child, reality is here. It belongs to you and me and God, and is perfectly satisfying to all of us. Only this awareness heals, because it is the awareness of truth." All right? He talks to us like a loving father. All right? Okay? And this is the idea of the atonement. All right? The acceptance of the atonement is the healing of the split mind. Okay? And just read it one more time and leave it like that. "Behold, my child, reality is here. It belongs to you and me and God. And it's perfectly satisfying to all of us. Only this awareness heals, because it is the awareness of truth." Okay. I will see you next time.